My name is Dave Moxham. I'm Deputy General Secretary at the STUC. Thanks everybody for joining us for the fourth in a series of 5 webinars about the future of our economy in the context of the COVID crisis. STUC policy, as I think I've said on previous webinars, is democratically decided through decisions made at our annual Congress, but that doesn't prevent us from wanting to engage in the wider economic, political and social discourse about what happens next. That's why we think it's an important time to bring together economists, academics, along with trade unionists and activists. Our view is that if working class people can't be involved in the discussion about our economics, then they won't be in a position to change it. Our 3 preceding webinars have been around the potential for a Green New Deal, around community wealth building, and last week about public ownership. And the frequent questions that come up when we discuss these topics is who is going to pay for that? And the trope of the profligate left compared to the position of the right as something that has plagued the left wing for as long as politics has been about. It conceals the fact that the right wing are very good at spending money. They were certainly very good at providing liquidity during the 2010 economic crisis, the question not being the liquidity that they were prepared to provide, but who it went to and who paid for that. So we find ourselves at a time when Prime Minister Boris Johnson a few weeks ago managed to describe himself, or at least reject the self-accusation that he was a communist, because apparently the discussion about Keynesian economics, investment-led economics, is back in vogue. The question of whether that's true, the question of whether we are following previous paths which led to failure, or whether there's an opportunity for change, is one of the big things that the trade union movement and the wider political movement is discussing in the period ahead. So to discuss that today, we've got 3 very, very eminent economists. The first who'll join us will be Grace Blakeley, who'll be known to many people. She's a political commentator, an economic commentator, a columnist, a journalist and an author. She's currently a staff writer for Tribune, but was previously economic commentator of the New Statesman and a research fellow at the IPPR. Her first book, Stolen: How to Save the World from Financialisation, was released last year, and I recommend that anybody who wants to become more literate on some of the questions that we will be discussing today considers that. We'll hear from Grace following my introduction. We'll also be joined by Laurie Mcfarlane. Laurie is a policy fellow at the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Policy. Prior to that, he was a senior economist at the New Economics Foundation, and he's written widely on the potential for state investment banks. His work's influenced the Scottish Government's new Scottish National Investment Bank, which is due to become operational during 2020. We'll also be joined by Professor Christine Cooper. She's a chair in accounting at the University of Edinburgh. Her research is concerned with the economic, political and social impact of accounting on our everyday lives. She previously headed up a tax and investment commission for the leader of the Scottish Labour Party, Richard Leonard. Just a word for those who haven't participated before about the format. We're going to hear from 3 speakers in turn. The total of those contributions will be around 30 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have around 30 minutes for questions and answers too. We're aiming to finish no later than 7:15. For those of you who want to participate in the discussion, please use the Q&A chat box. Your questions will be registered there. We'll be able to look at them and do our best to answer as many of them as possible. We do have a hashtag for this event and our series of events. It's hashtag rebuilding our economy, and the STUC will be tweeting from the event. Finally, I should say that the session is being recorded, and the STUC makes every one of these webinars available online for more people to come and watch them. So very, very grateful to our three speakers. Very, very excited to introduce Grace Blakeley. I think I've already given you your introduction, Grace, so over to you.
What an introduction it was. Thank you so much for that, Dave. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be here with such a great panel as well. So yeah, the question that we are here to discuss, of course, is how we are going to pay for the coronavirus crisis, which seems to be a question that is being posed quite a bit in the media at the moment. I know I'm certainly being asked that question a lot when I'm doing various media appearances. So it's worth, I think, contextualizing what's going on now in the history of really the British economy since the financial crisis and indeed before that. And perhaps using this moment to ask some deeper questions about both the nature of state spending and also the relationship between the state and capital accumulation and business and finance. That's really what I'm going to focus on in my talk today. So obviously the last time we had a crisis on anything like this scale, obviously not on this scale, but anything like this scale, was the 2008 financial crisis, which was obviously followed by a decade of austerity. Now, this government was elected on the promise that it had broken with that, sorry about that, that it had broken with that ideology. And I think now it's really important for us to try and think about how we can understand the differences in the government responses to various crises throughout time and space, because obviously the response to the financial crisis to COVID-19 will differ from country to country as well. I think what that question requires us to do is to understand, as I said, the relationship between capital and the state. Now, in order to understand this, we obviously have to think a little bit about capitalism itself. Now, for me, coming at this from a Marxist perspective, there is, the basis, the foundation for my analysis is that capitalism is subject to frequent periodic crises, those kind of longer term, more deep-rooted crises, and that the state actually develops in order to support big business and finance when those crises come about. So all of the kind of various regulatory interventions that have been developed over the last 100 years, whether you're talking about deposit insurance in the banking system, or even just Keynesianism as an approach to clearing up after crises, these obviously are mechanisms that allow states to support the recommencement of capital accumulation, recommencement of growth, and of profitability in the wake of quite profound crises. The problem is, of course, that over the long term, if that level of intervention that is undertaken during those moments of crises continues, then we start to see some challenges to the power of capital, to the power of big business, finance, etc. Because what we start to see is the economy becoming politicized. Obviously, if you have very significant levels of state intervention in, I don't know, whether it's like significant state ownership or intervention in the financial system, then it becomes very obvious that this idea that there is this significant separation between politics and economics, between the state and the market, is really a fiction, and actually states work with businesses, financial institutions, and international institutions to create and construct and reproduce markets. Now, as soon as that becomes widely understood, then it becomes much more difficult to bat back demands for things like higher spending on public services, education, healthcare, all these sorts of things, on the basis that they represent intervention by states into markets, because you start to see that those two things are co-constituted. And indeed, that is often why states that undertake quite a lot of economic intervention are not politically liberal. So they tend to have kind of different ways of dealing with those demands and making sure that the demands on the state don't become too extensive. And the second reason that we end up seeing state intervention expand and then decline following crises is that obviously if you have high levels of state intervention to support full employment, then you end up having the power of labour increasing relative to capital. So workers increasing their power at the expense of bosses. And the best example of this is obviously thinking about the aftermath of the Second World War, when you have the post-war consensus, Keynesianism as the kind of approach to managing the economy, targeting of full employment, and the way in which that strengthens the labour movement in its fight for higher wages. Now, that's an argument put forward by an economist called Koletsky, who argues that this is a major reason why we don't see higher levels of state intervention, even when it might be better for productivity over the long run. So as a result, often after crises, we get austerity to a greater or lesser extent. Now, in the aftermath of the financial crisis, we had a quite uniquely severe austerity program, at least relative to the size of the state prior to that crisis. And I think that reflects it reflects some of the longer term and more deep-seated challenges that are facing both British capital and capitalism as a global system. And really the reason that we had austerity in the wake of the financial crisis was not in order to pay for the crisis. It was a way to kind of wage class war from above. It was a way to constrain the demands that could be made on the state and prevent the politicization of the economy. Now, I think having that in mind, that gives us a better starting point for being able to understand what is meant by this question: who will be paying for the pandemic? Because of course it's very easy to come back at this with classic kind of economistic technocratic arguments saying cutting spending in the aftermath of the crisis is only going to increase the debt to GDP ratio over the longer term, because by cutting government spending, you are sending a message to the private sector, to consumers, which will discourage them at a time of very low confidence from undertaking their own investment and consumption. And over the long term, this constrains investment, productivity, etc., in what is already a very low investment, low wage, low productivity environment. So in order to kind of kickstart the economy after this, we're going to need higher levels of productive investment. So investment in things that are going to make the economy work better over the longer term. And indeed, that's the argument that basically the left has been making for quite a long time, really. It's a fairly standard Keynesian argument that almost everyone is really familiar with now. The problem is that it's not very compelling, and it kind of jars with people's subjective experience. So you could say all of that because few people really understand the kind of dynamics of state spending and investment. They use their own lives as a filter through which to judge what's going on. And obviously, if you as an individual take out a lot of debt, you have to pay it back. You can't carry on rolling it over for generations and generations. So this kind of argument comes up against quite a lot of constraints. I also think that it's not really cutting to the core of the challenge that we face here, because I think we really need to be shining, the left progressives really need to be shining a light on what is actually going on that relationship between big business, finance, central banks, states, and international institutions. What's become very obvious is that powerful states will lavish money on big business and financial institutions during downturns, and then force the costs onto working people when the economy recovers. Now, that has little or nothing to do with whether or not these states can afford to do one thing or another. It's a reflection of the power dynamics that exist in those societies. And indeed, if you look at this at the global level, those power dynamics are reflected again, because it's those large states that are able to undertake all that big spending in order to support their businesses and their economies, whereas smaller, less powerful, poorer states are unable to do that and often suffer severe debt distress when they try. So this is exactly what's going on in the global south at the moment. So I think, when we're asked this question, how do we pay for the pandemic? There's an argument that we can just pull out of our pockets, which is, we have to invest in the long term. We have to invest to combat climate breakdown. We have to invest to boost productivity. I also think there's an argument here about power. The question is not necessarily how do we pay for the response. It's who is going to pay. And part of the answer to that question has to be focused on what's happened over the course of this crisis, because we've seen governments spend huge amounts of money supporting businesses and only kind of vicariously supporting workers, and then saying, oh, well, actually this furlough scheme's a bit too much, workers getting addicted to it, so we better stop it. And instead, offering businesses a monetary incentive to keep workers on past the end of this scheme, which is probably not going to convince anyone. It's simply a giveaway to businesses. On top of that, you have what central banks have been doing, which is effectively creating huge sums of money, huge sums of money, pumping them into financial markets. So shielding investors, private investors, from the downside of their bets on financial markets, and actually making it incredibly easy for credit-worthy, unsustainable, unethical businesses to survive when otherwise they might have failed, and enriching people like Jeff Bezos by pumping up share prices. So all of these actions really suggest that the central factor in the government's decision-making throughout this pandemic has not been what's affordable, what's not affordable. It's been how do we prop up big business? How do we prop up private investors? And what's the minimum amount we need to do to support workers in order to prevent the economy from completely crashing? And I think because of that, the answer to the question, who is going to pay for the recovery from the pandemic, is very, very obvious. It's the people who've benefited from it. It's the big international monopolies that's seen their share prices go up massively. It's, you know, the hedge funds, the investment banks that have had bumper years because of the volatility in stock markets. And it's big businesses, financial institutions, and their allies really in the public sector who've benefited from this pandemic. And they're the ones that should be made to pay, not working people who have seen their salaries cut, who are likely to see mass unemployment, who were already very highly indebted, consumers, households in the global north as a whole, already highly indebted before the pandemic, and now they're struggling with things like, can they pay their rent, can they pay their bills? The argument that we're probably going to end up with after this crisis is, oh, we spent a lot of money, there's not enough to go around, we need to make some tough decisions, is actually an argument that we should reflect back on these people and say, yes, we do need to make some tough decisions. You are the ones that benefited from this. You are the ones that need to be making some tough decisions yourself. So, for example, 40 to 50% of the businesses that are in receipt of the government's bounce back loans are, according to the banks administering those loans, likely to default. What do we do in response to that? For me, the answer is very clear. Some of those businesses need to be taken into public ownership. Some of them need to be run. Perhaps, you know, it wouldn't be feasible to do that at the level of the central state. Perhaps it's local government. Perhaps they become worker-owned businesses, cooperatively owned businesses. And we actually enforce some proper environmental, social standards on these businesses that have benefited from government largesse. These are the kinds of policies that are to do with not just shifting and redistributing wealth, but are actually about challenging power relations in society and democratizing our economy, as well as deepening our political democracy. It's these kinds of interventions that I think are really what are going to allow the left to kind of to shine a light on what has been going on through this crisis and to make the arguments that we need to make in the wake of it. So yeah, I will leave there, and because I think I've gone over my time, and hand over to Laurie. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Grace, for that, and we'll have you back later to ask you some questions around that. Really grateful for your contribution. I'm now, as with Grace, I've already given a fairly full introduction to Laurie McFarlane, but Laurie, we're really grateful that you're able to join us today and maybe share your perspective on who pays for coronavirus.
Great, thank you very much. And thanks very much to the STUC for inviting me to the discussion. I'm going to be talking a bit about specifically how the newly established or soon to be established Scottish National Investment Bank can help us stimulate the recovery and deal with some of these questions that Grace just raised. But before I do, I think it's really important that we kind of contextualize the nature of the crisis that we're in, and also the shortcomings of the responses that we've seen so far from the government, both the UK government and the Scottish government, so that then we can then have a kind of useful discussion about what a useful role for the bank might be. We're obviously looking just now at potentially the largest economic downturn on record. And obviously in many ways this was to be expected, given that we've deliberately placed the economy in lockdown to protect public health. And obviously we've seen recent moves, although slower in Scotland, but certainly now we've seen moves to try and open up the economy and get things moving a little bit. But I think it's fairly clear that due to things like ongoing social distancing requirements, uncertainty, reduced household spending, etc., we're going to be looking at a period of subdued economic activity, and with it potentially a large spike in unemployment, particularly as the furlough scheme comes to an end over the coming months. And in terms of the response so far, although the UK government and the Scottish government have provided some cash support, so grants to firms and employers, and they've also done things like allow VAT payments to be deferred, the basic plank, the basic sort of strategy of the response is basically to make it easier for businesses to take on more private debt to see them through the crisis period. So we've seen things like the coronavirus business interruption loan, the bounce back loan scheme that Grace mentioned, also various schemes through the Bank of England. And all of these basically do the same. They basically make it easier for firms to take on more debt, often by basically giving guarantees to the private banks to try and cajole them to lend more money to businesses. Now, obviously, the problem here is that we're basically loading up firms, many of them who are already over leveraged, with more debt, which needs to be paid back with interest, in an environment where their ability to service that debt is seriously impaired. And I think Grace already mentioned just there that it's been estimated that anywhere up to half of this debt is expected that probably won't be able to be paid back realistically over the coming months and years. And so there's also a risk that if that happens, and if businesses do get into a position where they've got these debt obligations that they can't pay, their revenues tanked, etc., we are looking at a potentially serious situation where we see otherwise viable businesses start to fail en masse. We see a rise in unemployment, etc., and potentially then we see knock-on effects in the financial system as businesses start to default on loans, etc. The other thing that I think we should be worried about is that we could also see this leading to basically a concentration of ownership in Scotland's economy, which is already very concentrated. If we start seeing small and medium-sized businesses basically fail or get bought up by predatory capital or larger firms, then we will start to see the sort of growing concentration and monopolization of Scotland's economy as well. And I think that's something that we should be striving to avoid. So in terms of what we do about this and what a role for the Scottish National Investment Bank could be, I think that one option that we should be looking at is basically establishing or creating effectively a kind of state holding company or public investment vehicle that would basically be purchasing equity stakes or equity-like stakes in distressed but otherwise reasonably viable businesses. So this would provide an emergency injection of capital to businesses that often can't access it elsewhere, unlike your large corporates who can tap the markets or can tap the Bank of England. We're talking about firms here who really can't do that, and providing that kind of lifeline, sheltering them from insolvency and basically keeping them alive. This isn't a particularly new idea. We've seen measures like this taken throughout history. And interestingly, we've also seen the UK Treasury talk about creating a kind of something similar to this to take equity stakes in major companies. They called it, I think it was Project Birch is what they've called it. I think it's fairly likely, though, that the Treasury, in the case of the Treasury, they'll be looking at basically supporting the kind of large corporates and arguably strategically important sectors. They won't really be looking at sort of SMEs, and particularly in areas that are crucial to Scotland's economy. And so I do think there's going to be a big gap here. So I think that in the context where we've got the Scottish National Investment Bank launching this year, it's being set up, it's already recruiting expertise in managing public investments, it already has capital to deploy, although nowhere near enough. I think this is a role that the bank should be looking to play. Now, we need to be clear that this isn't about just sort of buying stakes in any businesses or keeping firms that were struggling anyway alive, or indeed supporting firms that are engaged in socially and environmentally harmful activity. This should really be about supporting firms that we think are good or contributing in some way and helping put the Scottish economy on a more sustainable path. Obviously, there's a question about what happens with these equity stakes once we start to see the other end of the recovery. And there's a discussion to be had there. They could be held onto by the bank. They could be sold back to the original owner. They could be sold back to workers. There's a whole range of possibilities that are really there to be discussed. Crucially, though, if we're going to see this kind of strategy take place, which I think we probably will, we will start to see the public sector start to take equity stakes, I think, at least at the UK level, if not the Scottish level. But it's crucial that we learn the lessons from the financial crisis here, where we did end up buying, significant stakes in firms, in this case banks, but doing so without really addressing the quite serious issues in these institutions or in these sectors. It was really a kind of no strings attached bailout of these industries. And so I think when we're thinking about this, we need to make sure that we're allocating money strategically, that they must come with stringent conditions attached on things like pay conditions, carbon footprint, tax payments, etc. And of course, we should be prioritizing firms and companies that align with or are willing to align with industrial policy and the primary missions of the banks, of the Scottish National Investment Bank. So that's one way which I think that in this sort of current moment, the current crisis, where I think the bank could play an important role. The other way, which much more relates to the purpose why it was set up in the first place, which is that, in my view, the bank should really be spearheading, once we're in the recovery phase, a public investment-led recovery. So investing across Scotland's economy, stimulating demand, creating jobs, etc. And so far, anyway, the bank's been set up with a primary mission, rightly in my view, to support Scotland's net zero transition. And it's not as if there's a shortage of work that needs to be done to get us from where we are today, with Scotland's fairly carbon intensive economy, to getting to that net zero position as fast as possible. And so in my view, the bank should be placed at the heart of a Scottish Green New Deal recovery plan, investing in green infrastructure, green housing, innovation, etc., helping to put Scotland's economy on a much more sustainable path. I think I'm probably at time, so I think I'll end there.
Thanks very much indeed, Laurie, for that. And you were exactly to time as well, which is good because it will leave us lots of times for questions. The only thing I would say on that is that all of you out there are particularly reticent today. Maybe you've just been enjoying listening too much, but just a reminder that you can post your questions in the Q&A box, and it will be really good to hear from you. We're now moving on, as people can probably see, to our third presentation, and that presentation is from Christine. I've worked for many years with Christine, and nice to see you again, Christine, and over to you.
Oh, can you see my slides?
Yes.
Oh, great. Okay, that's great. So thank you so much to the STUC for inviting me to do this. It's actually quite exciting. And for all of all of you who turned up on what in Glasgow is a very horrible evening anyway. So thank you. Yeah. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit just in general, kind of like Grace, but probably not as well in terms of like how I see the context of trying to pay for COVID, and then to talk a little bit about some taxation initiatives that we might like to think about. So yeah, so starting kind of really like Grace, I'm going back to the financial crisis. And so this was like a graphic, this is a government graph that I used to use when I was teaching about the financial crisis. And if you, I suppose, look at the extreme right-hand side of it, you could see that 2008, 2009, that was the worst part of the crisis. Government borrowing went up a tiny bit in proportion to the GDP. But I think the really interesting thing on this chart is if you look at the period after the Second World War, when the welfare state was being built, and there was huge government investment, and yet the debt as a proportion of the gross domestic product actually fell kind of dramatically as the state was investing a lot. So I suppose Boris Johnson hasn't exactly done this, and Grace also said about this, that we're kind of told that we have to pull in the purse strings as if we're running a household budget. And so Theresa May, I think this was on Question Time, she was asked by a nurse why the nurse couldn't have a pay rise, and you know, Theresa May alluded to this, or we don't have a magic money tree somewhere in the garden of 10 Downing Street or something. And of course, Margaret Thatcher did exactly the same thing. She loved to talk about, you know, that she was a grocer's daughter, and I don't know, like we had to look after the family budget in the same way really that Theresa May did. At the moment, I'm doing some research that's looking through Margaret Thatcher's archives. Absolutely fascinating. I mean, this is all free and online, so if you've got time at the moment, still during the lockdown, this might be something you'd like to do. But basically, the archives actually start really from Thatcher's birth. But if you look at the period like from 1970 up until 1979 when she was elected, there's lots of correspondence, firstly between Keith Joseph and Friedman and Hayek. And then after, you know, when Joseph didn't become the leader of the Tories, between Thatcher and Hayek and Friedman. And basically, you know, there's almost like the economics of madness, that all we need to do is just leave everything to markets and encourage personal incentive and everything's going to be okay. And if you, I mean, I suppose like the current situation absolutely demonstrates that clearly that cannot happen. If we just turned over everything to capitalism to try and solve the crisis, I suppose, you know, we'd be in a really, really, really bad mess. So, but in going back to this idea of, you know, like where the money's going to come from, I mean, the fact is that the UK does actually grow money all the time. And just as figures from 2009 to 2017, the Bank of England actually created £453 billion in new electronic money through quantitative easing. So I think this is exactly, you know, trying to reflect what Grace said too. The question isn't whether there's a magic money tree. In some ways, we can grow money. It's where the money goes once it's actually been grown. And again, I put the pictures up of the baddies, you know, Theresa May and Margaret Thatcher. Thought this is a picture of Prem Seeker, and he often tweets about this idea of a magic money tree. And like he tweeted that Tesco actually, this April, so, you know, just like a couple of months ago, Tesco paid £900 million in dividends, and at the same time it took £585 million from the government's business rates relief holiday that the government were doing because of COVID. So it's exactly this. The government clearly needs to start to invest. And if all they're going to do is give money to big capitalist institutions to pay out their huge dividend payments, this isn't going to create the world that we want to live in, nor is it going to seriously help the economy. Because everyone knows that, you know, if you want to regenerate an economy, give money to the poorer people and they're going to spend it. If you give it to the rich people, they don't, they just save it. So clearly taxation is a really important part of the economics of what's going to happen at the moment, and an important way also for the government to raise taxation. I mean, if you think, you know, if they didn't give that rate relief holiday, £585 million just to one company is like significant in terms of what else could be done with that money. So I'm going to just do a couple of things some work that I did on how to kind of encourage investment actually through taxation. So I'm going to talk really quickly about the land value tax and taxation on future North Sea oil. So in terms of the land value tax, I mean, again, you know, I can whip through this because probably everyone that is listening to this probably completely understands this. There's a significant, probably about half of Scotland is owned by less than 1,000 people. So Andy Whiteman did some research that said that the total land mass of Scotland is like 19 odd million acres, and nearly 10 million acres are actually owned by 969 people. So thinking about how to tax land is actually really important, especially in Scotland. And so the way that the land value tax actually works is it says, look, there are two ways really that we can enhance or that, you know, land actually derives its value. The first one is like, land is naturally lovely and beautiful, you know, it's full of natural resources and so on and so forth. And this isn't, those kind of things are not created at all by the owners of the land. The second thing that makes land more valuable is if, as a community, we actually invest in them through, you know, social activities, infrastructure investment projects, and so on and so forth. And then if you happen to own land near to one of these big investment projects, then your land value is going to increase, even though you haven't actually invested in the land or done anything to make it more valuable. So when we have a massive, you know, amount of land that's privately owned by very few people, they benefit the most from public expenditure and public investment. So, and the people that lose are going to be the people that don't own property. So yeah, so it's clearly, you know, and again, the devil's going to, of course, always with these kind of things is in the detail. And, you know, we don't want to tax people's gardens and so on and so forth. But, you know, this is definitely something that's completely worth thinking about. The reason why it's worth thinking about, aside from kind of important fairness issues, is really to try to encourage people to invest in and look after their land. So since it's land being taxed and not buildings, this should encourage people to actually make the best use of their land. So absentee landowners who just kind of leave their property to deteriorate, hoping that in, you know, some project's going to happen socially that's going to help it to go up in value, speculators that just hold land, you know, without making any improvements. Those people are going to be discouraged from owning land, or taxing them is actually going to encourage them to think about the way that they use their land, and therefore encourage them to invest in their land. In a modern economy, land value tax is also, the idea of this is also strengthened, because this is one of the very few taxes that's actually incredibly difficult to actually avoid. So that, you know, you can set up an offshore tax haven, but eventually someone has to know who owns the land. And so that means that, and it's very, of course, you can't, you know, send your land abroad or anything like that. So land's going to stay in Scotland or in the UK. And therefore, I mean, in some ways, this is like an easier tax to kind of, for the state to impose, because it's harder to avoid. Yeah, so that's the first thing. The second thing, I'm just going to talk about this. There's a wonderful report, or several reports actually, by a lawyer called Juan Carlos Bue, who, I mean, his report is like, it's also worth a read, because he kind of sets out how, when North Sea oil was first discovered, the British state really wanted to keep the oil prices as low as possible, because they were at that time trying to prevent the kind of rise of power in the Middle East. So they wanted to kind of maintain cheap oil to stop Middle Eastern countries becoming too powerful. And if the government had really taxed North Sea oil in the way that other European countries did, they would have got an additional 250 billion pounds over about 13 years. And at the moment, the British taxpayers are facing a 23 billion pounds bill for actually, it's kind of like the tax shield that they're going to get on the oil companies' profits, that they can actually use to reduce their tax bills when they do that, start the decommissioning of the oil rigs. So, you know, we've lost 250 billion in terms of, you know, not really draconian, just kind of normal taxation. And we're still kind of like going to have to give the oil companies back money because of decommissioning. So if you read the report, it talks about the effective tax ratio that's been significantly different, as I say, from other European companies like Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, you know, Germany, and so on and so forth. And if we hadn't have done that, we'd have been 250 billion pounds richer. Okay, so I mean, that was just like some work that I did thinking about taxation in Scotland. I just want to talk really quickly, I'm hoping I've got time, about what not to do. There's a kind of a growing thing in the state at the moment called social impact bonds, and they don't really seem to be, I don't know, kind of like in the media very much, but they're, you know, these things are becoming more and more kind of common and being used more and more. And the idea of these bonds is that the government doesn't have to invest in social projects, but they get charities or NGOs to actually borrow money from investors to invest in social projects. And then if the charity manages to achieve certain outcomes, then years down the line, they actually get some money from the government, and then they can pay their investors really quite significant returns. So the kind of diagram that here, it looks really quite complicated, but it really isn't. So in the middle section, you get the kind of like the charity, which here is called the Social Impact Bond Delivery Agency, and they provide services and to a particular target population. And in order to kind of attract the working capital that they need to provide these social programs, they make a contract with investors, and then the government, the public sector, makes a different contract with the charity, that if they can achieve certain social outcomes, then they can actually get paid quite significant, you know, kind of returns on their meeting the performance metrics. So I did some research in a social impact bond with a big housing charity in London, and what happened with this bond was that there were 5 different kind of like performance measures, including making sure that a homeless person gets into accommodation for 18 months. There was a kind of an element where the charity could get money if they encouraged the homeless person to go back to their country of origin. You know, so there were 5 different metrics, and if they achieved them, then actually this was set up by Boris Johnson when he was Mayor of London. Then the charity would actually get the money, and then the people that invested, they could get significant returns on this. So effectively what this bond did, and this is I suppose like the right hand picture, the person with quite holy socks on, is that it made homeless people kind of walking streams of cash for investors. So if the charity could get the homeless people to do certain things, then the charity would get money from the government. And I suppose it raises the question, it's never, like with these kind of social programs, it should be never just a question of the outputs that you achieve. Like we've got so many people into this much accommodation. Because as we've just seen from some of the events that are going on in Glasgow, you could say, yeah, we've got people off the streets because we put them into accommodation. But it's like, what's the accommodation like? And does it suit the needs of the people that are living there? So you could actually say, yeah, I've got someone off the streets, but it's like, but how did you do that? And like, what's the accommodation like? And what are the processes that you actually did? So the first ever social impact bond was a big experiment. It was the Peterborough Prison recidivism bond. And the organisation that promotes these social impact bonds is called Social Finance. And I listened to the webinar that was discussing, you know, how well the bond did. And the people from Social Finance, they sell these ideas across the globe. And so, like, you can't really tell who's listening into these things, but so I don't know how many people were listening in, but it was also in front of a live audience. And so someone from Social Finance said, when it came to the recidivism bond, if you're one of the charities that were part of this bond, what you would have actually been better to do is to shoot people as they come out of prison. So then you could make sure that they didn't reoffend and you'd actually get all of the money. And I was completely shocked because everyone laughed. So, yeah, so, okay. So this is like my last thing, is just really to say, if you hear about these social impact bonds and if they kind of start raising their heads in discussions and you have any say in them, you need to think about what they're really doing. Okay, that's me. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much indeed, Christine. And I imagine that what will happen now is that we'll bring back our other panelists as well. So I'll just fill in a couple of moments while that happens. Just to say, be careful what you ask for. I said we didn't have any questions. I've now got this ridiculously difficult job of looking at a whole range of different questions and trying to group them together. What I'm going to start by doing, and I hope I'm not just like throwing in too much of a curveball here, is we did get a question in fairly late, which I suppose at the end of the day is about growth and degrowth. So a lot of the discussion that we're having just now is about how we recover economically, how we grow our economy, and in some quarters, how we use that growth to pay for the spending that we've got. But I suppose this question's a little bit more about how should we be talking about growth just now? Is it reasonable for us to be talking about growth in the way that we did before, particularly for the trade union movement, who I suppose particularly talks about growth as a way to recover our position? I'm just interested in the three speakers' reflections on how should we be talking about growth in the context of paying for the coronavirus. Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to take a first knock at that one. So yeah, I mean, I think some of the arguments raised by those who are very much behind the whole degrowth perspective are very legitimate. You know, GDP is not a good indicator for measuring well-being. It accounts for lots of things we wouldn't want to account for. So, you know, for example, it was going up dramatically before the financial crisis. Obviously, that didn't account for the massive risks that were being taken in the finance sector and the bubble that emerged in housing markets. And it doesn't account for a lot of things we would like it to account for. So, you know, environmental degradation, for example. So obviously GDP is a flawed metric. My issue with the language of degrowth is that when you start talking about degrowth, it summons up images and concepts and frameworks based on scarcity. So if you start saying to everyone, look, everyone has enough now, we don't need to grow the economy anymore, let's actually start talking about shrinking the economy. Even if what you actually mean is we need to kind of make sure that the resources that we do have are better distributed and perhaps start lowering growth in the global north in order to facilitate you know, higher growth in other parts of the world whilst offsetting the emissions that are associated with that. What people will hear is, these people want me to be worse off, right? So I think there is something to be said for the way that we talk about the economy, that we measure the economy. Obviously, talking about GDP and the massive focus that we have on GDP is not helpful, it's not useful, and it would, I think, be helpful on a number of fronts if we were to move towards discussing, you know, a much wider set of metrics. But I hesitate at saying, yes, we need to start talking about degrowth because of those kind of linguistic and narrative considerations, which are obviously very important for you know, the left as it's in opposition, which is you know, we are attempting to build support for our ideas.
Laurie, Christine? Thank you, Grace.
Yeah, I mean, I'd probably echo much of that, to be honest. I mean, my own personal view is that I agree. I think, to be honest, it's not a particularly radical position now to say that GDP is a very flawed measure of progress. That's fairly mainstream now. And the reality is that if we're going to tackle the key challenges of the 21st century, we need some things to grow. You know, we need renewable energy to grow. We need other things to grow. We need some things to shrink. We need fossil fuel industry to shrink and other things as well. And for me, we should be focusing on the things that actually matter. Creating good, well-paid jobs, alleviating poverty, raising living standards, decarbonising the economy, etc. And then if, as a result of that, you know, GDP, as it's currently measured, sort of increases by 2, 3, 4%, or indeed 0%, then that, for me, that's kind of like a you know, a not very interesting residual. So it's focusing on the things that matter rather than getting caught up on this, you know, growth, degrowth kind of binary debate, I think.
Yeah, can I just say I agree with all of that. You know, honestly, we need to retrofit our economy in terms of, you know, better transport links, you know, better train links. We need, you know, more sustainable housing. I mean, honestly, the housing stock in Britain is really, you know, not fit for purpose in the 21st century, given all the technologies that we've got. So I think, yeah, and I completely agree, you know, that we don't want to keep making more and more and more stuff that we don't need and doesn't make us happy. Nonetheless, you know, there's a lot of investment that's still actually needed. I'll just say this about oil as well. I mean, if we taxed oil really heavily and make it really, really valuable, eventually, I mean, I think, you know, like we're going to need it as a chemical that's useful for all kinds of things. And we should just stop burning it. So it's not, you know, I'm not trying to say that we should have a kind of a fossil fuel economy, but what we need to do is understand that oil is, you know, is an input into lots of things, chemical things that we actually need. And we should treat it as a really valuable, precious resource.
Okay, thanks very much. In my next attempt to throw a net over a couple of questions, I'm gonna just try and explore with the panelists a bit more tax, I suppose, at the end of the day. I mean, Christine, you obviously talked about LVT, and you'd probably say that one of the reasons for that is that it's a tax that can be run in Scotland, and that it's a relatively, if everything's relative, but a relatively immovable tax base. But I guess what we haven't really dug into is the difference between wealth and income taxes. Traditionally, or by orthodoxy, one wouldn't expect the government to be looking to increase taxes in the current period, although it may find itself in a more difficult position that it wants to be in. And it may be fair to say that the UK government has at least recognise the problem of revenue, although it's a long way from saying that it wants to introduce wealth taxes. So I suppose just if the panelists have got anything to say about the differences really between wealth and income taxes and what particular part they could or should play in the recovery. Is that a fair? People are nodding enough to say that that's a fair question to ask. So I'm going to go back to Grace again first to give Christine a breather.
Yeah, so yeah, I didn't actually mention it in my talk, but I think one of the ways that we can reframe this question away from, you know, how do we pay for the pandemic to who pays for the pandemic, is to start thinking a lot more about this question of wealth taxation. Because as I was saying, you know, we've had a lot of government interventions that have effectively increased asset prices, which has served to basically increase wealth inequality, to boost the wealth of the already wealthy, without providing the same levels of support for people without those assets. So it really does just make sense on a basic equity perspective to say central banks have been propping up asset prices. Those returns were not generated through any, you know, hard work or, you know, frugality on the part of the people who undertook those investments. Why are we not taxing this wealth? And obviously, you know, there are many different ways you can do this. We've obviously started to see much more pick up on equalising. I think Rishi Sunak has now said he wants to do this, equalising the returns from wealth, so the income from wealth on things like capital gains and dividends with income taxation, which is something that, you know, progressives have been arguing for a very long time. Indeed, I argued for a similar proposal in a paper quite a while ago. Maybe we also need to think about a one-off wealth tax, which would actually be a tax on assets, so on the things themselves, the value of those assets held, rather than simply the income derived from them, in order to pay for the pandemic. Now, perhaps the best way to do that would be to levy that tax on financial assets or something along those lines, given the very high inequality in ownership of financial assets. Equally, you know, second homes, something along those lines. There are lots of forms of wealth that are highly unequally distributed that could be taxed much better. And I'm sure Christine and Laurie, because they are experts on this, will have a lot more to say as well about this idea of a land value tax, which I also think is a very good idea. One other thing I would say is that, so thinking about wealth taxes, also potentially corporation tax as well, seeing as a lot of those big businesses are going to have benefited quite a lot from government support. We need to think about tax avoidance and evasion, and how do we deal with tax avoidance and evasion. Now, there are a lot of different kind of regulatory reforms that can be undertaken. So, I mean, you know, just the very obvious ways in which the British state supports ongoing links between financial interests in the City of London and the UK's kind of network of formerly independent tax tax havens. Secrecy jurisdictions would be one of them. Another one is just to beef up the power of HMRC in order to cut down on tax evasion. But I also think we need to consider constraints on capital mobility, particularly for the very wealthy, in order to prevent just legal ways of moving money around the world in order to avoid tax. And that's something that's probably a much more radical perspective, but one that I think is necessary if we want to really reform the tax system. And indeed, if you look back to when we had much higher levels of income tax than we do now, kind of top rates of 70–80%, that was associated with controls on capital mobility.
Thank you. Laurie?
Yeah, I think there's a strong case that we should definitely be talking about a wealth tax in the context of COVID. I mean, even pre-COVID, the UK tax system, I think, grossly undertaxed wealth. And so we should have been doing that anyway. But I think there's a specific case around this crisis, which relates to, I think, what both Christine and Grace mentioned in their talks, which is we've seen the government and the Bank of England pump an enormous, unprecedented amount of money into the economy. And we really need to think about where's that money ending up and what's the impact of that. There's good reason why they've done this, obviously, because things like the furlough scheme, people needed it to make ends meet, those on low incomes in particular. But that money, they've not held on to it. That's then gone straight out the door, often if you're a renter, to your landlord to pay rent, to pay all the things that you need to pay. So that's flowed straight out the door. And there are those who've actually done quite well out of this crisis. Then there's the fact that those who are actually on higher incomes and professional jobs, the kind of jobs that is actually you've been able to do from home, they've over the past 3 months have been getting a decent salary while not spending any money because they've not been able to spend any money. And so now we're sitting on fairly large cash piles, actually. So a lot of this money that's been pumped into the economy is basically starting to accumulate in the bank accounts of the well-off. And it's, to me, what will they do with that? Will do like they always do. They'll invest it in financial markets and indeed in the property market, in buying second, third homes, push house prices up, then sort of creating this vicious cycle, making inequality worse. And so for me, we do need to be starting to talk about a kind of emergency wealth tax in order to try and that point that Grace was saying, not how do we pay for it, but who do we, who pays for the crisis? And I think that's an argument that we need to be making.
Yeah. Could I just, of course, I agree with really both speakers, but there's I don't know if this is still on, I think it's probably still on YouTube. There's a Glasgow University professor called Greg Philo, who actually got money to do kind of like a big survey as to whether people should have a one-off kind of big wealth tax after the financial crisis. And actually he found that people, even the rich, actually thought that they should, just have this kind of like one-off, just pay it, and it should be based on literally on the thing like your property and the stuff that your valuable things that you own. And if you can't afford to pay it because you live in a big house, but you don't have much cash, wait till you've died, and this could have actually paid off the national debt. So I mean, it's actually worth having a look at this this clip, because it's. I just think it's like, well, why didn't we do it? Because it was such an obvious thing to do. The other thing I would say is, like Laurie's right. If people have got loads and loads of cash in their bank accounts and they go and buy shares with it, that's not actually investing. It's like we talk about investing in shares. All you're actually doing is buying shares from someone else, and so it's not actually investing in anything at all. This is what Marx, it's fictitious capital. So yeah, so like take, let's use it for something really good, better society.
Thanks very much. Okay, listen, I'm because the next question is going to be quite focused on the Scottish National Investment Bank, I'm just going to hit Grace with a question. Not that you wouldn't know something about the Scottish National Investment Bank, but probably less than Laurie. So the basic question is, are the solutions that were coming up not just going to bust the central banks? So it's about...
Right, yeah, well, probably not. So, yeah, I mean, are they going to bust the central banks? No, obviously central banks are supported by the state, and if we're thinking about what would kind of a threat to central banking look like, that might be people arguing that the role that central banks are playing is increasingly political, and central banks are supposed to be nominally independent, and that might be a kind of threat to our idea of what central banking should be. Of course, central banks haven't always been independent, and they have increasingly been undertaking distributive policy measures. So the whole argument for independent central banking was that the interventions that they would be taking to target inflation would not be distributive. They would be about kind of maximizing growth and efficiency, but obviously quantitative easing in particular, and now the kind of alphabet soup of asset purchasing programs that are being put into place by, for example, the Federal Reserve, are definitely having an impact on inequality, for example. So it makes sense that we should be saying what is being done by the central bank should be democratically accountable. Basically, the central bankers should be accountable to the rest of society. The other question that we have, of course, is around the point that Laurie was mentioning, which is we came into this crisis with businesses in particular, less so financial institutions, but particularly a lot of businesses having very fragile balance sheets. And that was in part a result of quantitative easing itself and of very low interest rates, because these businesses have been encouraged to take on lots and lots and lots of debt. And that was in the context of relatively low growth, low productivity, and also widespread financialization. So these businesses were thinking, where can we put our money in order to maximize returns? Probably not in building a factory, because the real economy isn't doing so good. We could buy back our own shares or merge with or acquire other corporations. So you had a lot of debt. It wasn't being used productively. So we ended up, on the verge of this crisis with businesses with very fragile balance sheets, and a lot of them have been bailed out either by states or by central banks, depending on the balance between those two things in different economies. Now, obviously, there remains the danger that these businesses will default. A lot of people on the right will be saying, will be agreeing with these points that we're making about kind of corporate capture and central banks creating moral hazard, but they'll say we should let all these businesses default. Now, I think those of us on the left could recognize the problems that would be associated with that, huge problems associated with letting kind of, 50% of small businesses, for example, just go under, and the cascade that would affect, potentially leading to kind of deflation. Whereas actually we need to be thinking a lot more creatively about how we manage the issues that we have today as a result of both this crisis and the preceding fragility that existed in the economy before that. And again, I think that means thinking creatively about different models of ownership. So perhaps, public ownership, as Laurie was saying, there's this idea that the Treasury was forced to put together about potentially taking equity stakes in some of those companies. But there's also, we can think about these companies being bought out by the state and then transferred into worker ownership or into cooperatives if they're much smaller, because obviously it's not feasible to have the state running thousands of small businesses. So I think we need to be thinking creatively about responses to this crisis and recognize that a lot of the challenges that we're facing are created and constructed by the way that we manage our economy, rather than just inherently and completely intractable problems.
Thanks so much for that, Grace. Okay, so we've got 7 minutes left, so I'm going to combine a final question with our panelists' opportunity to either answer that question or say anything else that they wanted to say or read in the questions that I missed. But we did have a few questions specifically, Laurie, about the Scottish National Investment Bank. And just to sum that up, some of it, I suppose, is about quantum. I sit on an awful lot of different Scottish Government groups where the answer always seems to be the Scottish National Investment Bank. I'm not sure that I've managed to add up the full total of the investment called for and the kind of quantum available. I suppose linked to that are questions that we've received which are more about the use of public spending generally and levels of conditionality. So one of the questions about the Scottish National Investment Bank is, are we just talking about, a positive mission statement, or are we talking about a mechanism that actually follows its investment down the supply chain and looks to do what it can to positively regulate the labour market? So some of that's about how much money are we talking about if we're talking about an effective Scottish National Investment Bank, and the other's a more general one about what's the potential but also the limitations of using conditionality around procurement, whether that's locally or nationally, to deliver some of the positive regulation of the labour market that we'd like to see. Sorry, question's probably longer than your answer, but over to you, Laurie, first, and then Christine, and then maybe Grace, you can sum up for us.
Yeah, great, good question. So I'll try and be brief. On the quantum, so at the moment, the current plan is that it will be capitalized with initially 2 billion, but that will be paid in over a number of years. So for me, the first thing is that needs to be paid in on day one, like now, particularly given the crisis that we're in, and increased at least to, I'd say at least 3, if not 4. The second thing, though, is slightly more complicated because the kind of financial firepower of institutions like this, typically elsewhere, it's not just about the initial capitalization, it's also about the extent to which they can leverage their balance sheet through, for example, issuing bonds to finance investment. And that's a slightly more complicated question in the Scottish context because of the fiscal framework between the Scottish government and the UK government. And there's currently discussions going on about the extent to which they'll be able to do that. And obviously when you're dealing with the UK Treasury, that's not always an easy discussion. And so that's a kind of unknown. But certainly at the moment, I think there is the availability. The Scottish Government has got more spending through Barnett consequences, etc., to rapidly bring forward the capitalisation of the bank and scale that up to, as I say, to 2, 3 or 4 billion and get that moving straight away. On the conditionality point, yeah, I mean, bluntly, the bank does have the power to basically, at the end of the day, you say, you know, here's our terms for this support, and you can either accept that or not. And I do think they should be fairly strong and fairly robust on this. So things like, I think, looking at things like pay ratios, for example, making sure that you know there's trade union recognition that everyone's paid at least the living wage, that companies aren't avoiding tax, that perhaps things like an ambition to have worker representation on boards and things like that. And so I do think there is an opportunity here to use this as a fairly powerful instrument to sort of affect change in the wider economy.
Thanks so much for that. Christine, wow. I didn't take you last this time.
I was just thinking, how do I follow that? You know, I just kind of completely agree with everything that Laurie said. Yeah, on the issue of I suppose the role of a bank is that the role of most banks, I mean, clearly not, you know, not a central bank, but the role of most banks where we need to go and borrow, most of us have to go to borrow money, is to maximize their shareholder value. So, you know, they're not really concerned with society at all and building the economy or worrying about all the stuff that we really need. So that's why we need an alternative so that people can go along. And of course, you know, and to help them grow their businesses or whatever. And of course, there should be strong conditions attached to that. So yeah.
Okay, thanks, Christine. And Grace, any last words that you like, really, either on that question or anything else that you think we've kind of missed?
I think the other two panelists have done a fantastic job of putting some real meat on the bones of the kind of policies that we're going to need to be implementing in the wake of this crisis. And I completely and utterly agree about the long overdue need for, yes, a Scottish investment bank, but also a wider UK national investment bank, local investment banks. Laurie's written extensively about the need for a kind of publicly owned retail banking system, again, that actually serves businesses and customers on the ground. I think that is going to be really, really important. And, you know, I think the way that we get there, the way that we get towards the transformation of our financial system, the way we get towards a Green New Deal is not simply by making the same arguments that we've been making for the last 10 years, those kind of technocratic arguments that didn't really cut through. I think the way we get there is by really getting to grips with the way in which political power is exercised in this country, how centralized and concentrated it is, and actually building worker power from the ground up in order to push back against that, which is exactly what the trade union movement is all about.
Thanks so much, Grace. Anyone that finishes with workers' power is obviously going to ingratiate themselves with the STUC, but I know it's a theme throughout your book. So thanks very much for that. Listen, we're just moving to the end now. I do want to thank all of our speakers, not least because I don't know if this is something that people who watch know. But as soon as we end this session, we don't just end it for the people that are watching, we end it for the panelists too. There's no virtual green room after this. So this is, thank you very much to all of our speakers. It's really a great session. It's really flown past. Next week's webinar is going to be on social security, the labour market. We'll be looking at the jobs guarantee scheme, the 4-day week, and the debate around the universal basic income. And don't expect everybody next week to agree on that. So if people want to come and fight about some of those concepts, then please do. You'll be able to register for that through the STUC website, but everybody who registered for this webinar will also receive an invitation to the next. Yeah, it's been a really, really great session. It's exactly 7:15. Thanks again to our speakers. Thanks everybody for your questions. Sorry we couldn't answer them all, and I hope that people will tune in next week. So thanks to everybody. Good night.
Thank you.